What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Dumo Show, where we talk all things motivation, education, and of course, entertainment. We do hope that the previous episode did help you, especially to the storytellers out there. And thank you for stopping by today. We do, of course, continue today with our story September. Welcome back to the studio, sir. Almost mentioned your name there, but welcome back to the studio. Thank you so much for joining us. Take us away with the different types of endings, did you say? You'll be explaining today the different types of endings to stories
Yes.
that you could have. Take it away.
Yes, thank you so much. It feels good to be back in the studio. Um, yeah. The previous episode was pretty good and insightful, I believe. To the storytellers out there. Thank you so much. So yes, before we get into the different types of endings, there's just something that we have to address, which is the every story. It has two important aspects. The protagonist has a need and a want, and so does the antagonist of the story. There's always a need and a want, and there's always this struggle, this battle between those two opposing ideas. So essentially, the protagonist, what they want, is what you see them fighting for throughout the film or throughout the novel, throughout the story. But essentially, it's what they need which is uh, 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 unpacked in what we call the B story. So there's something called an A story and a B story. Essentially, the A story is the main story that you see. It's usually external, whereas the B story is usually internal for the protagonist. So you don't really see it, but the protagonist feels it. Right.
You mentioned that the antagonist also has needs and wants. Do they also have a B story?
Well, that would depend on the type of antagonist that you have. You could have an antagonist which is a human being. So if your protagonist and antagonist are both humans, then it's likely that your antagonist will have a B story. But it's not law, so to say. However, if your antagonist is something like a natural disaster, take for example the movie 2012. If your antagonist is like a natural disaster or an external force, then it's unlikely that it has a B story, right? Because a B story usually goes with the emotions that a particular person feels.
Okay. Okay. Tell us about the different types of endings.
Right, so the different types of endings that you have is either your character, your protagonist, sorry, gets what they need and what they want. That's kind of like a sweet ending, for mostly of those happily ever after type of stories. Or your protagonist could get neither of what they need or what they want. Um, those usually have tragic endings. The best example I can think of is Shakespearean plays. Most of the time, the characters get neither of what they need or what they want. You just look at the story of your Romeo and Juliet, for example. The both of them they want to be with each other, um, but we all know how the story ends. No spoilers. um, and also at the same time, they don't get what they need, which is for the two families to settle their feud. So it's a bit of a sad ending there. Um, there are two other options that you have, which is for your protagonist to get what they need, but not get what they want. And on the flip side of that coin, your protagonist can get what they want, but not what they need. Right. So an example that I can make of that is someone who wants wealth, wants to inherit um what their family has, family's fortune. So we have, let's say, a father passes away, um, and then your protagonist essentially wants to inherit the fortune that the father had. But now the problem comes in that the protagonist, they have to do something in order to inherit that fortune. And in the process of doing that said thing throughout the film, throughout the story, throughout the novel, your protagonist ends up getting what they need rather than what they want. So they end up learning a certain lesson, or they end up mending certain relationships with family rather than getting the money that they wanted. So essentially, at the end, they might have resolved an issue that they had, either with a family member or whatever, um, rather than to get the fortune that they wanted at the beginning of the story. So that's when your character gets what need rather than what they want. And on the flip side of that same story, you could have your character getting what they want but not what they need. Um, so essentially, your character wants to inherit the money, um, but they inherit the money. However, it's at the cost of the relationships that he or she has with family members. So at the end of the story, you might realize that the protagonist inherits the money. However, his or her mother, sister, brother, whatever, end up hating him or her. So yes, the protagonist gets what they want, but then they lose what they need, which is family relations. Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, is it possible for your protagonist and your antagonist for them to both get what they want and what they need?
To be honest with you, I'm not quite sure because I've actually never thought about that. I've never come across an example that I can think of from the top of my mind that has that type of circumstance. However, I wouldn't say it's impossible. Um, yeah, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it would be very challenging. That's what I can say. Perhaps it could be, a psychological thriller that has that type of outcome, um, because it's not a usual story to for both protagonist and antagonist, to end up getting to the end of their story. Because what happens most of the time with stories, the way that a story ends is that essentially the protagonist story ends, but the antagonist story doesn't necessarily end there. It continues, but it continues off script or off screen, or in another novel, should another novel, come about. Or the antagonist story ends, but the protagonist story has not ended. So the best way that I can explain this is when you have as human beings, as living entities, we're alive, right? So let's say you have a pet, and let's just say that pet was born before you were. So essentially, you were born after your parents adopted that pet. After a couple of years, that pet dies. So essentially, the pet's story has ended. However, your story has not ended, right? And the reason for that is because your story started way after the story of the pet started. So essentially, our endings as living entities or as human beings, our endings have different points in time. Yeah, I think that's the best way I can explain it.
That's actually a pretty good way to look at it. That was a good example. Thank you so much. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in to the Dumo Show, where we do talk all things motivation, education, and of course, entertainment. Catch you next month from myself and everyone at the studio. Salute.